Hello, everybody. So, as promised, this is just a couple of, additional slides or a little bit of extra information just in relation to constructivism. So, this isn't critical information, um, compared to what we would have covered live in class. But if you're interested, it's just a little bit more background and a little bit more, I suppose, of the theory and experiments and kind of philosophy that kind of underline constructivism. So, no harm to maybe know about it. Again, like I mentioned, just even with a view to being able to impress clients or kind of bully them into doing what you're suggesting based on being able to talk the talk and throw about a bit of terminology and theory. So like we mentioned in the session, constructivist approach basically asserts that individuals construct their own knowledge through actions and experiences and subsequent reflection on those actions or experiences. And obviously in the class we would have seen some of the implications that would have in terms of how one constructs learning experiences, or how a constructivist approach might differ from other approaches in terms of the social elements, the amount of autonomy you give learners, the kind of activities you're getting them to do, and just generally how you kind of see learners compared to behaviorism, kind of viewing them as blank boxes, and cognitivism, which is more maybe concerned with how we all process information. So when we talk about constructivism, what we talk the kind of philosophy, I guess, which kind of underlines it is empiricism. So empiricists claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all our concepts and knowledge. Now, this is kind of contrasted with the kind of the underlying kind of philosophy of cognitivism. When we talk about cognitivism, its kind of core philosophy is rationalism. Now, rationalism claims that there are ways that concepts and knowledge can be identified or understood independently of sense experience. So, whereas empiricists claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all our concepts and knowledge. So, what that really boils down to is this kind of different view between cognitivism and constructivism in basically how the world works and how we can actually gain information. So, essentially, kind of constructivism is this notion that all that we can understand is really, we're only ever going to be able to take it in through our senses. So through what we see, hear, touch, taste. That's the only way in which we can actually understand things, the only way in which we can imbue knowledge. Compared to rationalism, which is the cognitivist kind of philosophy, which claims that there are ways of understanding things beyond our sensory experiences. So, this notion that kind of we can all come to a common understanding of something, and that kind of represents a real and true kind of iteration or a particular concept, and we all have the same understanding about it. You can kind of see this reflected in how cognitivism works and how constructivism work. Cognitivism kind of assumes to a certain degree we're all looking at the same thing. So when I show you a diagram of the sensory store, I'm seeing the same diagram that you're seeing, and because we're seeing the same thing, we can kind of develop this kind of common, shared, completely identical understanding. That's how we kind of take in information. Constructivism, with all its kind of focus on social interaction and engagement, and like the previous slide said, kind of this idea that kind of we construct information, we construct our own understanding, and kind of through experience, through my experience versus your experience versus someone else's experience, is more in line with empiricism, which suggests that you can only kind of understand what you take in through your own senses. So that ultimately is kind of the difference between, the rationalism of cognitivism and the empiricism of constructivism. Cognitivism kind of assumes that we can all understand the same thing in exactly the same way, whereas constructivism would kind of argue that, well, look, because your experience is different to my experience, is different to someone else's experience, there is no one specific understanding. And when we talked about it in class, one big element in terms of constructivism is looking at something from different angles, different points of view, different beliefs, different interpretations. Now, constructivists don't deny the existence of the real world. So it's not that they don't think that, it's not that they don't believe that there is a real world and that we all draw our information from that kind of shared space. But they would argue, empiricists or constructivists, that what we know of the world stems from our own interpretation of our own experiences. So human beings create meaning as opposed to just acquiring it or being born with it. And again, you can kind of see this reflected in constructivism, this notion of you develop your own experience, you develop your own understanding, you construct everything that you kind of learn. So that is kind of the notion of empiricism, which is the kind of the underlying philosophy behind constructivism. And a big empiricist as well was John Locke, the philosopher. So I'm sure you've probably come across him in some form or another, but there is a quote from him there: no man's knowledge can go beyond his experience. And I guess it's something we mentioned in class, but one of the challenges of constructivism, or for us in kind of adopting a constructivist approach, is kind of that notion of, okay, well, look, if everybody is their own, if we can only understand something through our own experiences and all our experiences are going to be different, what's the point? What's the point in learning this? What's the point in sitting through this lecture? What's the point in listening to me blab on? Because your experience is going to be different to my experience, is going to be different to someone else's experience. So that is kind of a challenge maybe that exists in kind of adopting that constructivist, empiricist kind of philosophy as well. And one of the kind of major, I mentioned there that kind of, I didn't mention, but one big kind of rationalist philosopher as well is Descartes, and Descartes being most famous for, I think, therefore I am. So a couple of other kind of philosophies, which maybe kind of you can kind of link to different some of the different major pedagogical schools that we looked at. Objectivism, somewhat similar to behaviorism, or at least kind of somewhat similar to the behaviorist viewpoint or perspective or theory, I should say. So it's that reality is external and is objective, and knowledge is gained through experiences. And again, that's kind of in line with what we talked about of behaviorism as being, behaviorists as viewing the mind as this kind of blank box, as this sponge, and you just, throw stuff into it and it all just gets hoovered up. Pragmatism is kind of somewhat similar to cognitivism in that reality is interpreted and knowledge is negotiated through experience and thinking. So pragmatism would maybe kind of align with kind of some of what we covered in terms of cognitivism, that idea that kind of we take in information, but that the kind of the transfer of that information to our sensory store, to our working memory, to our long-term memory, that kind of development of understanding is kind of very much based on how we process the information, how we think about the information, how we interpret the information, and how we experience it. And that is what leads memory to be retained, leads information to be retained into our long-term memory, which according to cognitivism is kind of where you want to get it. And then in interpretivism, I always struggle to pronounce that, is maybe a little bit similar to kind of what we talked about when we were talking about empiricism there. And interpretivism, kind of similar maybe a bit to the constructivist philosophy, states that reality is internal and knowledge is constructed. And there's a link there to a particular article. I'll put the link up onto Canvas as well. You can maybe take a look at that in your own time, which covers a couple more different kind of theories which might be of interest. One other philosophy which kind of underlies cognitivism and behaviorism is objectivity. Objectivity is not to be confused with objectivism, which is an Ayn Rand philosophy, and which is kind of a crappy philosophy, just in my own humble opinion. If it's of any interest, he maybe even with the view to your games and narrative module, there was a game called BioShock. which was kind of critically acclaimed as kind of imagining this objectivist kind of society and kind of how that collapsed, and kind of just something worth a look if you're bored and looking to do a bit of research into the whole area of games and narrative. It's a game called BioShock and kind of focuses on objectivism. Also, constructivism is not an art movement from Soviet Russia, just so you're aware of that. Constructivist is constructivistic art is kind of this particular kind of very Soviet style kind of art movement, which emerged in the middle of the 20th century. And again, very interesting stuff there if you do want to take a look. But constructivism is not a single theory, so hopefully that even came across a small bit in the training session that we have. Like I said, when I talk about constructivism, there's no one major, essential, absolute practitioner or kind of individual tied to constructivism. When we talk about behaviorism, like that really is very much like clearly linked to Skinner and to Pavlov and to Watson, but there's no one big constructivist head honcho, or there's no one big constructivist experiment and everything kind of comes from that. So when we talk about constructivism, it's not one thing. Try and think about it more like, as is mentioned there, a gravitational force. I would say most educators for the most part are constructivists in their own way. They would agree with a lot of the active learning approaches which are mentioned, the notion that kind of learning is a social activity, so on and so forth. But I think most people generally would be on board with the notion of constructivism, and it's kind of the key tenets kind of that surround it and the methodologies related to it. But there isn't 100% consensus, and there's no one big constructivist kind of philosophy or theory that kind of ties it all together. It's more like constructivism for our purposes is more like a lot of little things that all kind of add up, or that all kind of align in a particular way. But maybe one or two things just to be aware of, one or two kind of not practitioners, but people who are maybe kind of quite influential on the whole notion of it. One is John Dewey. So he was one of the first to move away from the whole notion of traditional education, which would be very much kind of, that kind of very antiquated view of students in a classroom taking notes, having to recite stuff and getting battered if they don't. So Dewey was one of the first to move away from traditional education, and one of the first to propose education based on inquiry and discovery. He was quite kind of radical for his time. He wrote quite a number of books on philosophy and psychology, and kind of in particular education, and I think My Pedagogic Creed was one of them. He also kind of placed a strong emphasis on directed living, which is really just kind of the notion that we apply and integrate learning into our whole lives, not just as students. So that kind of, for proper learning to take place, it has to go beyond the classroom, and it's something we have to apply in our own lives. And he also had a very strong belief in lifelong learning and good practices. So he encouraged a very holistic approach to education, and that he was of the opinion that all learning kind of nurtures good habits, and that leads to future learning, and that whole thing is kind of one big kind of repetition. So he kind of he had a strong belief as well that kind of teachers should go beyond just like teaching people, not that they should go beyond just transmitting information to students, that good teachers should provide psychological benefits and social benefits, and that those things would help students, I suppose, progress socially. So Dewey was a very big name in the whole area. And another kind of name which you might have come across before is Jean Piaget. And I said he's kind of, like I said, there is no one big philosopher or one big experiment, but he is considered a bit of a godfather in the whole area of constructivism in education. And he was very interested in the whole notion of, I suppose, frameworks of intellectual development. And he kind of identified intelligence as very much like, I suppose, broadly the ability of people to learn about their environment. So how people adapt to their environment. And I suppose one of the reasons he's quite associated with what you could consider almost like the first wave of constructivism is adopting essentially a more kind of child-centered approach. And I guess when you think about what is mentioned there as the ability, intelligence as the ability of people to learn about their environment, that is quite a child-centered approach, because what do we do in our childhood years more so than kind of learn about the world and learn how to adapt to it? And he had two processes when he talked about, the notion that intelligence is us adapting to our environment. Assimilation and accommodation. And where we might have come across this before is when we were talking about cognitivism and how information to get into our long-term memory is either assimilated or accommodated. Assimilation essentially means that kind of new information is kind of merged or is kind of brought into our existing schema, into our existing understandings, into our existing ways of kind of structuring information and categorizing information. And then accommodation is where new schemas or new categories or new ways of thinking have to be kind of created or set up. And he essentially, Piaget, his kind of one of his big experiments, or one of his big kind of theories, is this thing, the stages of cognitive development. So essentially he was able to identify and break down the different types of learning that happened to all of us between age 0 to 12 plus. So he said that the sensory motor stage is from birth to age 2, and that's where a child, like when we're infants, learns by doing, by looking, by touching, and develops a very basic cause and effect, a very basic notion of cause and effect. The pre-operational stage then is from age 2 and lasts until stage 7, and that's where we learn about language, symbols, in particular letters and numbers, egocentrism develop, so on and so forth. The concrete operation stage then is from age 7 to 11, where we're learning how to think logically. We develop more of an understanding of the cause and effect relationship. We become more aware of the whole notion of conservation, reversibility, serial ordering, and then finally from 12 plus we develop abstract thinking ability, deductive reasoning, comparison, classification, so on and so forth. And I suppose this theory is important because I guess it ties into a lot of other theories which we'll come across during the course of the module, including but not limited to Bloom's taxonomy, Maslow's hierarchy, so on and so forth. Now, someone which I think I mentioned before, Leo Vygotsky, who is a Soviet psychologist, and he was very much interested in areas like developmental psychology, the development of children, education. So he had quite a broad kind of range of views, and he kind of tied it all together, and much of his work, as identified there, inspired kind of a second wave of constructivism, which was more socio-cultural. So if Piaget was the godfather in the first wave, Vygotsky was the second wave. And he's probably best known for his work on what became known as the zone of proximal development. And that is essentially this kind of view of cognitive development, which kind of compares and contrasts what a learner can do without help and what they can do with help. So he also did some very interesting work, if anyone is interested, on the psychology of play, which kind of makes sense in terms of him kind of being identified or aligned with constructivism, because when we're playing, we're constantly creating and testing and developing and kind of making sense of things within a particular framework. We're kind of building up, constructing kind of our learning. Again, very similar to constructivism. We're constantly, it's like playing is never just a process of just taking in information and spitting it back out. It's testing, understanding, working within particular boundaries and confines, so on and so forth. So it does make sense that kind of the whole area of play is quite related to the zone of proximal development. And anybody who's played sports will, at a certain level, kind of, a certain amount of creativity, like what separates great players very often, or great sports people, is a certain amount of creativity, a certain amount of originality, that they kind of push the envelope, that they do things in a different way, that they have different perspectives, that they have different approaches that they try to things. And I suppose where Vygotsky in particular maybe, and the zone of proximal development can become quite an interesting area for us as e-learning designers and developers, is if we think about game-based learning. So, this kind of, it's why over the past number of years, kind of video games have become kind of a somewhat kind of a big area in terms of e-learning trends and kind of development. It's certainly one of the reasons why they are their own module on this masters, is because games are kind of fantastic learning tools. They present constant challenge, constant feedback. They encourage us to operate at the best of our abilities. Learners have to constantly take in information, adapt that information, to make choices in the games, to react within games. And the other thing about games as well, when you kind of get down into the theory of it, is, most games do, like for most game, like any kind of game you have a person play, at least at the beginning, they do need to be told, what to do, where to go, how to do this, how to do that. So, like, I read a great quote a good while back that kind of said, look, anytime someone is playing any kind of game, they're always learning. It's just, the type of learning that kind of happens. Even someone playing a game for fun, they're going to be need to told how to play the game, what the rules of the game are, where to go. And also most games nowadays, they're never going to start very, very hard. Like, the idea of a game is it's constant challenge and constant feedback. But, like in a lot of what we've looked at so far, you got to start off simple and kind of easy, and then make it harder and harder as the player develops and gets more comfortable. But anyway, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development basically identified the kind of gap between what a learner can achieve independently and what they may be able to achieve with more assistance from what's known as a more knowledgeable other. So the zone of proximal development is this kind of gap, or this kind of, depending on how you think about it, it's either a gap or this kind of, a shared space between what a learner can achieve by themselves, what a learner can do entirely by themselves, and what a learner can't do by themselves. And Vygotsky's kind of theory around this was that kind of this is really where the learning happens, and kind of that, from an e-learning perspective, I guess here is kind of, where the necessary information is provided to learn and to gain the relevant skills and knowledge. And very often that might be structured or individualized or just in time. So even go back to what we were talking about there in terms of video games, like, this kind of zone of proximal development is where the player has to complete a challenge, but also where they're given the relevant information to kind of do so. So if you want to walk, you got to press this. If you got to jump, you got to press this. You need to get through, to get through this level, you need to do this, you need to do that, so on and so forth. Maybe in a more formal context where we might have seen this kind of idea is in some of the Rosenheck stuff that I talked about in the main session. So this notion that, okay, if we're in this zone of proximal development, what can the person do by themselves, and what do they need kind of help with? What can't they do by themselves? And this kind of represents a kind of a gradation of that kind of area. So at the beginning, they might need a lot. They might not be able to do a huge amount by themselves. But as time goes on, as you constantly examine their progression in this zone, you can kind of see, okay, they can actually do more and more and more by themselves until almost the more knowledgeable other is kind of faded away entirely. And again, this is, I think, a very similar kind of process. It represents a very similar kind of step in terms of, just that same notion of being able to provide information and just in time, I suppose, just in time, scaffolded, structured, individual kind of information, not to kind of overwhelm the learner, but just to kind of give them the help that they need, the specific information and learning that they need when they need it. And that kind of, the learner is constantly, as is identified here, planning and doing and reflecting so that, they're constantly putting kind of what they've learned to use, instead of just taking in information passively and applying it. And the more of that they do, the less kind of support, the less resources, the less that they will need. So those are just a couple of practitioners or kind of experiments which relate to constructivism. They're all very applicable, but maybe in a fairly abstract way. So you don't necessarily need to worry about kind of like tying them in very specifically to the whole area of constructivism in terms of what we learned. But again, certainly no harm to be aware of them, and kind of if you are trying to bully a client into kind of listening to you and taking your advice seriously, maybe no harm to maybe throw around, Vygotsky, kind of when he talked about the zone of proximal development, so on and so forth. So hope that was useful, everyone, and talk to you again soon.